Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. Big thank you to Johannes for inviting me to speak here this afternoon. So today I'm going to be talking about the first experience you ever had. It's probably not an experience that you remember, but nonetheless, your first experience. And specifically, we're going to be searching for the emergence of consciousness in infants and maybe, just maybe, in fetuses. Okay, so allow me to introduce myself. I'm Joel Frohlich. My family name looks to many of you like Frohlich. So I had German ancestry from 4 generations ago. And unlike my great-great-grandfather who immigrated from Germany to the United States, I've immigrated from the United States to Germany. So I'm a postdoc at the Fetal MEG Center at the University of Tübingen. So you can see here a picture of me with my boss, Hubert Preissl. And we have here with us one of the only fetal MEG machines in the world, actually only one of 2 fetal MEG machines in the entire world that can record magnetic brain signals from fetuses. So we're very proud of that machine, and you'll hear more about it later. So I'm very interested in the developmental origins of consciousness, and this is a nice confluence of 2 of my earlier areas of focus. So I did my dissertation in neurodevelopmental disorders at UCLA, and then I did my first postdoc also at UCLA studying disorders of consciousness. So this is really the convergence of both of those 2 areas in a sense. So just to give you a sense of what you can expect from this talk today, we'll be talking obviously about consciousness, but not so much about models. I'm going to take a rather theory-light approach here, although of course I will mention the theories, but you'll see why that is later. And we're going to have a developmental timeline, and we're going to look at different developmental time periods and consider the plausibility of consciousness beginning actually during those periods. Okay, so of course I'm going to introduce a lot of key concepts and ideas, and maybe some of these ideas can be the seeds for your models of consciousness. Okay, so first I'd just like to start with an exercise. I'd like you to consider, what is your earliest memory? So really try this right now. You can close your eyes if you need to. Try to think back to the absolute earliest memory you have. And if you can, consider how old you were when that memory occurred. Now, it might not be easy to do, but give it your best guess. See if you can remember your earliest memory and see if you can estimate how old you were at the time. Okay, so you might be able to go back fairly far in your development. You may be able to go back to, say, age 3 or age 2, but I'm quite certain that none of you remember the very beginning, okay? None of you remember your birth, and obviously none of you remember anything before that either. Of course, there are a few people in the world who claim to remember their birth, but these are very dubious claims in light of infantile amnesia, which is a pretty ubiquitous phenomenon. Okay, so even if you don't remember your birth, that doesn't mean that you were necessarily not experiencing your birth. It doesn't mean that you were a zombie at the time, okay? So obviously we can't introspect about infant consciousness. We can't rely on our memories of it because we don't have those memories. And of course, when it comes to infants, well, we can't exactly ask them questions. And they're not very good at following commands, of course, and they have immature motor skills. So we can't usually deploy the same sort of tasks we would deploy in adults to test for consciousness. So a tempting approach might be to just fall back on the theories of consciousness. But here we run into a different problem because the theories all give different predictions, right? So you might have on one extreme here IIT, which is a low bar theory. It has a lower threshold for consciousness than other theories, and it would obviously predict an earlier developmental onset than, say, for instance, higher order theories, which have a higher threshold for consciousness and would predict a later developmental onset. So this figure, by the way, is in the review I had with Tim Bain and some other colleagues in Trends in Cognitive Sciences last year. So that was called Consciousness in the Cradle. So you can look for that paper if you'd like to see the figure again. And of course, beyond that fact, there's no one theory that the whole field throws their weight behind. If as a discipline we had all converge, or as many disciplines, if we could all converge on one theory, that might be one thing. But as you're very aware, nobody can agree on which theory to use. So that's the reason why I'm motivated to use a very atheoretical approach. So this is an approach that Tim Bain and some other co-authors and I have advocated for, and we call it the cluster-based approach. Okay, so it's a theory-light approach. And the idea is you take some markers of consciousness that have been developed and validated already in adults, and then you see where they lie in infants. And of course, you can't trust any one marker in infants because you don't know if it would translate into infancy. Okay, you don't know if it's valid in infancy, but the aggregate of many markers you would hope would converge on a particular developmental time period. So that's why we call it a cluster-based approach. All right, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with this figure yet because we'll come to some of these in the talk, but just to give an overview, there are a few markers that have already been applied in infancy, which will be useful. So one of these is functional long-range connectivity. So that's very important for theories that emphasize network integration. And of course, there have been studies of network connectivity in infants, and as you'll see soon, even fetuses. There's also attentional markers that recruit frontal brain regions. So even if you tend to throw your weight behind, theories that emphasize prefrontal networks like global workspace theory, there is some evidence that that's emerging already in the first months of life. And there's also multisensory integration markers. So believe it or not, you can actually infer the McGurk effect in infants. You obviously can't ask them to report on their experience, but you can look at the McGurk effect paradigm and see, like where an infant is looking on a visual display for congruent versus incongruent trials. And then finally, there are these local global prediction markers and the local global paradigm, which has already been discussed a lot in this conference. So I don't think I need to go much into detail, but we will discuss it a lot later. And then finally, because this is, of course, an approach that's very heavy on neural markers, I think I should just go briefly into the methodology to make sure we're all on the same page here. So the first approach I'm going to talk about is infant EEG. This is, of course, a direct marker of neural activity, and it's ideal in infants because it's relatively motion tolerant, okay? Putting an infant in a scanner is really difficult, but putting an EEG cap or an EEG net on an infant's head is a bit easier. Okay, so this is a go-to approach for many of these studies. Believe it or not, there's actually even portable infant MEG now that can be done using next generation optically pumped magnetometers. So these are room temperature MEG sensors. Unlike the superconducting MEG, they don't need cryogenic coolant. So you can even sew these into a little cap for an infant and do infant MEG this way. And then we have the method which we use in Tübingen, which, as I mentioned, we're very proud of, which is fetal MEG. Okay, so this is actually bespoke hardware using the current generation superconducting MEG, where we have this concave array of sensors that complements the maternal abdomen. So the idea is that a pregnant woman can kneel in front of this sensor array, and we'll actually be able to pick up fetal cortical signals amongst many other signals, such as the maternal heart and the fetal heart and so forth. So there's a lot of data pre-processing that goes into fetal MEG, but of course, it's a really exciting technology. And there's only 2 of these devices in the world. So the only other one is in Little Rock, Arkansas in the United States. And we can also deliver sensory stimuli to the fetus with fetal MEG. So, of course, there are a lot of studies that use auditory stimuli, but it's also possible to do visual stimuli. So red light will pass through the maternal abdomen and reach the fetus. So you can just have this array of fiber optic cables. And you can see here in this long exposure photograph, there's red light that's shining into the womb. And so you could record, for instance, visual evoked fields in the fetus. So the next type of measures I'm going to talk about are hemodynamic measures. So these are indirect measures of neural activity. They're actually measuring deoxygenation of blood, but from this we can infer brain activity. So the first would be fNIRS, functional near infrared spectroscopy. I don't actually talk that much about fNIRS in this presentation, but it is a popular method because has very quick setup time. So that's really essential when you're studying infants is fast setup time. Unlike EEG, you don't have to calibrate your electrodes by, pipetting gel or putting some electrolyte solution on each electrode. Okay, so these are optodes, fast setup time, great for infants. The other method, of course, is infant fMRI. Okay, so this is a really cool approach, but it's extremely difficult to do. A lot of infant fMRI studies are done with the infant sleeping, but that makes it really hard to study cognition and consciousness, of course. So there have been a few studies recently, though, actually doing awake infant fMRI, which I'm completely amazed is possible, but it is being done now. And so typically you might have the infant swaddled, like what you see in this photo here, and then placed in the scanner. Okay, so let's consider the three logical possibilities. Either consciousness begins before birth, it begins during birth itself, or it begins sometime after birth. So we're going to go through all three of these, and we're going to start with before birth. All right. So I think the earliest we can really seriously talk about consciousness beginning would be 24 weeks gestation, which is the beginning of the third trimester. So up until this point, there are no sensory afferents reaching the cortex. It's at 24 to 26 weeks gestation that we have this milestone where the thalamus, which of course we all think of as the gateway to consciousness, finally innervates the cortex and sends thalamic projections, which feed sensory afferents to the developing mind. Up until that point, you don't have any visual, any auditory, any tactile, any taste information for the mind to develop around. Okay, so this is just a wiring diagram showing those thalamic projections innervating the cortex. And maybe you're skeptical, maybe you think, okay, but couldn't there be some sort of island of awareness before 24 weeks? And I think there's evidence to the contrary, actually, from infants. So if you look at infants, young infants, when they're operated on, they're not always given general anesthesia because general anesthesia carries some risk of respiratory depression, which is obviously very dangerous. So sometimes they're just given a spinal anesthetic. Okay, so this is just stopping sensory afferents at the level of the spinal cord. But even with that much attenuation of sensory input, you see the infants go into what looks like the sleep-like state. Okay, so this is characterized by sleep spindles and slow waves. Now, this seems to be the case just because the infant brain isn't very mature yet, and it can't sustain consciousness when it has a certain attenuation of sensory input. You don't see this in adults. So if you heard Cyril's talk yesterday, you know that adults can go into a sensory deprivation tank and maintain consciousness. But with spinal anesthesia, that seems not to be the case in infants. And then a fetus is even less mature than an infant. So if an infant can't maintain consciousness under this condition of sensory attenuation, it doesn't seem reasonable to expect that a fetus could be conscious with absolutely no sensory input, right? Now, of course, we could talk about the very, very first conscious experience one has as perhaps being an experience of pure awareness, or the famous MPE that's been much discussed at this conference. So in Thomas Metzinger's recent book, The Elephant and the Blind, he does very briefly mention this and touches on fetal consciousness in one passage. So at any rate, perhaps during the Q&A, it would be very interesting to get more of his thoughts on this, because it is really interesting to think we all started out from an MPE. Okay, but at any rate, the third trimester is really the beginning of plausible consciousness. And we don't even know, obviously, if there is consciousness there, but it's the first period when I think we can have a serious, reasonable discussion that maybe there's some sort of conscious awareness. So now you're asking, okay, that's the theory, but where's the evidence? So there have been some really interesting investigations of this at the Fetal MEG Center at Tübingen. So this is work that I was not involved in because it took place before I moved to Tübingen. This was led by Julia Moser, a PhD student at the time, who is now a postdoc at the University of Minnesota in the US. So she implemented the local global paradigm in fetuses. I think all of you have heard about this paradigm. It's certainly been discussed a lot at this conference, so I don't think I need to go into a whole lot of detail describing it. But just to give a brief overview, you have these auditory sequences of tones, and you can have deviance both within the sequence or between sequences. Okay, and then the idea is you play a template sequence for the fetus, and the fetus is more or less trained to expect this sequence. And then there's a test phase to the experiment where you play different sequences back, and some of them follow this template. Most of them follow the template, but some violate the template. And you want to see if the fetus has a prediction error in the MEG signal, showing that it actually recognizes those global deviants. what Moser et al. Actually found was that starting from 35 weeks, you start to see evidence in the MEG signal of these global prediction errors, which is really remarkable. I mean, it's obviously not like conclusive evidence by any means of consciousness. And as I emphasized earlier, none of these markers taken in isolation are ever going to be conclusive evidence. But it is at least suggestive of the possibility that maybe there's consciousness in the weeks before birth. So, it's often said that this global prediction, or this local global task, requires working memory and therefore requires consciousness. And we often see that this is a somewhat reliable marker of consciousness in adults with disorders of consciousness. Okay. Next, we'll also look at the default mode network. So this is the most famous of these intrinsic fMRI networks that I mentioned earlier, and has been discussed a lot at this conference, so I don't think I need to really explain it to you. But there's some interesting work by Thomason et al. 2015 in developmental cognitive neuroscience showing that if you look in the weeks before birth, you already start to get this sort of proto-DMN. Okay, so I think that's most clearly seen if I show you the posterior cingulate cortex as the seed region here. And if you look at 35 to 38 weeks, which was actually the post-menstrual age, so gestational age, that would be 37 to 40 weeks, you already start to see this network of medial brain regions that looks like the DMN emerging. Okay, so again, that per se doesn't prove consciousness by any means, but it is suggestive that maybe there's something starting to happen. Okay, so now we're going to move on to possibility number 2, which is that consciousness actually begins during the process of birth itself. Okay, so you might ask, well, what's special about birth that it would actually start really during that particular experience? Well, obviously, a lot changes at birth. Okay, it's arguably the biggest transition you've ever experienced, assuming that you experienced it. For one, the fetus goes from the state of co-embodiment with the mother, getting all of the nutrients from the placenta, to then going to this autonomous state of having to feed, find the mother's nipple to feed, and so forth. There's also all these sedating chemicals in the womb, whereas in the process of birth, there's this big burst of adrenaline and noradrenaline. So just if you look at physiological arousal and the level of wakefulness, it may be that the capacity for consciousness was there earlier, but the fetus and now baby isn't really woken up until the process of birth itself. But I think if you look at this from a predictive processing framework, probably the most interesting of these transitions is a transition from in the womb having a very controlled, very predictable environment to then after birth having this high variance, noisy environment. So assuming that consciousness is playing some sort of practical role here and generating a model of the external world, this is where it would be really useful to have consciousness, right? So just to clarify that a bit, let's consider the womb environment. So auditory stimuli do reach the womb, but they're muffled. They're attenuated by about 30 decibels, which is like wearing really good earplugs. And moreover, red light does pass into the womb through the maternal abdomen, but obviously it's extremely blurred by the point spread function of the womb. So many of you have probably tried this before. You put a flashlight behind your hand and you actually see that red light can pass through tissue. Okay, so that's the kind of light that will presumably reach the fetus, but completely spread out and blurred. So it's not like the fetus will ever see a complex visual stimulus inside the womb. You'll certainly never see anything like a face. And it's also unclear if the fetus can sniff. So olfaction is interesting. Of course, it's an exception in a lot of ways. For one, it doesn't pass through the thalamus. So this got brought up also in one of the keynotes from Tuesday, where hemispherectomies were discussed. But even though the olfactory nerve is an outlier in that sense, it's unclear if the fetus can actually sniff because it's in the amniotic fluid. Okay, so not clear if you can sniff in the amniotic fluid. And furthermore, there's this waxy substance that covers the fetus's body, and that would also seem to cause problems of actually being able to sniff anything. So it might be that chemosensation is actually just limited to taste before birth. All right, so the transition to the postnatal environment is huge, okay? So all of a sudden, the baby finds itself in this environment that's bright, that's loud, that's noisy, and that's difficult to predict. Okay, so this would obviously be a very overwhelming sort of experience and perhaps almost like a little DMT trip for the baby. Okay, so in terms of prediction, if we want to look at this in a predictive processing framework, I think the ideal task to apply here is, again, the local global paradigm, because we're actually looking at prediction errors. And that's exactly what Moser et al. Did several years ago. So in the study I talked about earlier with fetal prediction errors, they actually followed up on some of these subjects after birth and then recorded from them as newborns, okay? So this was actually just using the fetal MEG machine again. You can also record from infants this way. The idea is that you put the infant in a cradle, you put the cradle toward the sensor array, the infant just lies headfirst on the sensor array, and you have a little infant-friendly headphone, also MEG compatible, to play auditory stimuli. So it's the same task I described before, and the same machine, in fact, to record MEG signals. And in fact, Moser et al. Did find evidence of both local and global prediction errors in these newborn subjects. Okay, so this is really cool. There was evidence of the mismatch response with a short latency, and then this global prediction error response with a longer latency. And they even found that this depended on heart rate variability, which I didn't mention, but that was also a finding in the fetal study as well. There's some evidence that this is influenced by arousal state. So it's as if, some of these newborns, they're in a state closer to wakefulness, and they're conscious and they're able to attend to the stimuli perhaps, or at least perceive them. Whereas there are other newborns that are, deeply sleeping, unconscious, and therefore unable to generate these prediction errors. All right, so that's pretty cool. Of course, this had been shown before in infants, but just not such young infants. So there was this Bassaral study, Bassaral et al. 2014, 10 years ago, which showed this in 3-month-old infants using more or less the same task. I mean, a variation on the local global task. So it's not completely new to show this in young infants, but it is new to show this in neonates and like very young infants just in the first weeks of life. Okay. And finally, you might recall this figure with the sort of proto-DMN, and you might wonder, okay, how is that developing? What does this now look like after birth? So we already saw there was sort of, this kind of like rudimentary DMN starting to take shape in the weeks before birth. And then there was this work by Hu et al., 2022, in brain communications coming out of Trinity College Dublin, which looked at a very nice large sample of over 200 full-term infants and 70-something preterm infants. So really nice sample size, studied them with fMRI. And what they found was that you're getting a lot of these functional connectivity networks definitely in place by full-term birth, okay? Which is probably a surprising result to many of you. So the DMN, which we're the most interested in, perhaps, at least for the purposes of this talk, is already present by full-term birth. Of course, it's in an immature state, but it's already present. And then there were other networks like, I think, the dorsal attention network, for instance, which was already present even before full-term birth. So that's not before birth, but it's in, again, these preterm infants before they would reach term equivalent age. Okay? So finally, there's the third possibility that consciousness actually begins after birth. And this is in some ways an uncomfortable one to consider, because we're considering the possibility that immediately after birth, a newborn isn't conscious yet. So for instance, 15 years ago, Christoph Koch famously wrote this essay for Scientific American, and he was considering the very same question. When does consciousness arise? Is it in the womb, at birth, or during early childhood? And he almost had to start off the essay with a sort of apology. He said, mothers will want to crucify me for the seemingly cruel question, but it needs to be posed. How do we know that a newly born and healthy infant is conscious? Okay. So with that, you might now be asking, okay, who's really an infant consciousness skeptic? Like, who really thinks today in 2024 that, infants are maybe unconscious? Well, we actually have data on this from the Franken et al. 2022 survey, which has also gotten brought up a few times at this conference, of course, not in this context. So this is a really beautiful open source data set. So I was able to take these data and reanalyze them to answer this question and break this down by academic discipline, right? So it's like a solid 8 or 9% of experts who will say, babies are probably not conscious. And that tends to be across disciplines. All right. Now, if you look at psychologists and neuroscientists, there's maybe, like 10% or so who are agnostic or give a neutral answer. And it's always a little bit less than half who are completely confident that babies are conscious, right? But if you include everybody who's saying that babies are at least probably conscious, you've got like a really solid consensus, like 80% or higher, saying that, okay, yes, infants are probably conscious. And you actually get the most skepticism coming from these other disciplines like computer science or engineering. Granted, there weren't a lot of participants in those disciplines, but there we had something like a quarter who were really just agnostic or gave a neutral response, and then only a quarter who were completely convinced that babies are conscious. Anyway, the point being, yes, there is a strong consensus today in the field, at least as revealed by the ASSC data from 2018 and 2019. And the other interesting thing is that if you break this down by theoretical views, it doesn't really vary that much. So, you can look at these data according to who thought which theory was at least probably a promising theory. And it's certainly not as if the IIT theorists are all convinced that babies are conscious. And on the other hand, it's certainly not as if the higher order theorists are all doubting that babies are conscious. You get pretty much the same breakdown in all of the major theories, which I thought was interesting. Okay, now maybe we should ask, is there anything from the perspective of developmental biology, developmental neurobiology, that would cause us to doubt that babies are conscious? Is there any milestone they haven't achieved yet that might be necessary for consciousness? Well, personally, I don't think so. But if we really wanted to exhaust this option, we would probably want to focus on the postnatal GABA shift. Okay, so just to make sure we're all on the same page here, GABA is gamma aminobutyric acid. Okay, it's the principal inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain. And of course, in the mature nervous system, GABA is hyperpolarizing, meaning it's inhibitory. But in the immature brain, for instance, at birth, it's depolarizing. Now, that doesn't mean that it's always excitatory. There's something else called shunting, which is a little bit technical, so we won't get into it. But normally, even when it's depolarizing, it's inhibitory. But there are at least some synapses in the brain at birth where GABA is actually excitatory. Okay, so you might ask, why does this matter? Well, of course, you need this balance between neural excitation on the one hand and neural inhibition on the other hand to have complex neural computations, right? And if nothing else, you certainly need GABAergic inhibitory transmission as this counterweight to neural excitation so that you're not just constantly having a seizure. Now, it is true that newborns are more vulnerable to seizures than adults. But that being said, it's not as if every baby is born seizing. That's not the case. Okay, we know that GABA is very often inhibitory, even at birth, but at least at some synapses, it's excitatory. Okay. Now, here's where this becomes relevant. We have many theories which associate consciousness with complexity. So it's not just IIT. There's also, for instance, Robin Carhart-Harris's entropic brain hypothesis. And complexity, in turn, may require some sort of balance, all right? In this case, a balance between excitatory and inhibitory processes. That's not just in the nervous system. This is just sort of like a general finding from complex systems. So for instance, this animated GIF you're looking at, this is a simulation of a chemical reaction called the BZ reaction, where you have an inhibitory and an excitatory reagent, all right? And you get these beautiful spiral waves from this delicate balance between these two processes. And so similarly, it may be that in the nervous system, if you have this fine balance between excitation and inhibition, you get these complex neural activity patterns, which could in some way be necessary for consciousness. Okay? And we could look at this empirically, right? We can actually take recorded neural signals. We can estimate their complexity. More technically, we can measure the entropy of the signal, the number of different ways in which states of the signal can be arranged. And of course, we could look at how that changes over development. And then we might ask, okay, is there anything here that's actually possibly relevant to consciousness? So this has been done, by the way, at least in preterms, it's been done a few times. People have taken EEG recordings from preterm infants, and they've measured the entropy of the signal, and then they've seen that, okay, the entropy seems to increase in the first weeks of life, at least in these spontaneous recordings, which are usually obtained from sleep, okay? So to begin, we had this hypothesis, and we said, okay, we've got some fetal MEG data. including before and after birth, some recordings in newborns as well, as you saw earlier. Why don't we take these recordings and see how the entropy of the signal changes with gestational age? And we had this hypothesis that, okay, it would make a lot of sense if, you looked at the youngest fetuses, say beginning at 25 weeks gestation, maybe they have the lowest neural complexity. And then you look at the ones a bit older, maybe in the weeks before birth, they have higher complexity. And then you look after birth and newborns, and they'll have even higher complexity, and their complexity will continue going up as they get older and so forth. That seemed like a very intuitive hypothesis. Even outside of this context of the postnatal GABA shift, you can think about the increase in anatomical complexity in the human brain as it develops. That was our hypothesis. Turns out we were completely wrong. So this was pretty surprising to me, at least at first. I think in hindsight, there is a way to make sense of it, which we can go into more detail during the Q&A if you like. But this is just showing like probably the most classic entropy estimator, which is the Limpel-Ziv complexity. And what you're seeing is that with each gestational week, the entropy of the signal is actually dropping. Now, keep in mind, these are auditory evoked signals, whereas other studies were looking at spontaneous signals. So that is a big difference. These are the exact same data that Julia Moser collected for her study. We're just looking at them in a different context now where we're not so concerned with the global prediction error. But we see that the entropy is actually decreasing in fetuses. And it gets even stranger than that. Okay, because we see it in male fetuses, but we don't see it in female fetuses. So that was also very surprising. And at this point, I'm scratching my head and saying, well, it seems like this has nothing to do with consciousness anymore. There may be some other interesting developmental process going on, but I wouldn't say this has anything to do with consciousness, of course. We use 6 different entropy estimators. So we use various algorithms, and they all had very similar results. So this was a quite consistent finding. And then, of course, as I say, we followed these subjects up after birth. That was part of Julia Moser's original study. And then when we apply the entropy estimators there, we no longer have the interaction of sex, but we do see that there's this monotonic decrease with complexity for each week of gestational age in the newborn. So it's continuing to decrease even after these babies are born. So this doesn't really fit very well with the idea of the post-GABA shift influencing complexity. And it doesn't really seem to tell us any kind of story about consciousness. Nonetheless, it is interesting in other perspectives. So we published this in Nature Mental Health earlier this year. I apologize that it's behind a paywall, but if anybody would like the paper, I'm more than happy, of course, to email a PDF. Okay. So as far as the neural complexity part of the story goes, I'd say, of course, so far the results are inconclusive. It's really not straightforward at all to make conclusions about consciousness from the neural complexity we see in infants or in fetuses. Also not very straightforward to make any conclusions about the postnatal GABA shift. In fact, I would say, I don't think the postnatal GABA shift is probably relevant for consciousness. Obviously, you've got enough inhibitory neurotransmission at birth to have behavior, to not be having a seizure. And so I think you already have enough from birth to be conscious. Okay, that's my view. Now, even if we say that infants are conscious, it's likely that their consciousness is, of course, very different from adult consciousness. Okay, so let's consider what is infant phenomenology actually like? Well, the infant, it seems, would have no sense of self. Okay, the infant wouldn't be having the subject-object dichotomy that we have in dualistic perception as adults. The infant would not engage in mental time travel. The infant's not thinking about what it's going to do tomorrow. Okay, the infant's not like ruminating on what happened yesterday. And to borrow these phrases from the psychologist Alison Gopnik, the infant has this more lantern-like style of attention rather than this focused spotlight attention that we have as adults. So if you consider those bullet points together, this sounds a little bit like the effects of psychedelic drugs. And so people have actually, thought about this and said, okay, maybe the psychedelic state is a decent model of infant consciousness. And in fact, in Michael Pollan's popular 2018 book on psychedelics, How to Change Your Mind, he does interview Alison Gopnik and ask her about this. So Alison Gopnik says, if you want to understand what an expanded consciousness looks like, all you have to do is have tea with a 4-year-old. And so now we're even talking about children now. We're not even talking about infants necessarily anymore. And then Michael Pollan adds, or drop a tab of LSD. So the similarities here that are noted in the book are more mental noise or entropy, magical thinking, little sense of self that is continuous over time, diffused attention, and so forth. Okay, but there are definitely some big limitations to the psychedelic model of infant consciousness. Okay, actually quite a few, but I won't have time to go into all of them right now. But let's take visual phenomenology to start with. So let's say you're out hiking somewhere really beautiful. You stop, you see this canyon scene. If you have normal vision as an adult, it's going to look something like what you see up here. Okay. Now let's say you're carrying an infant with you while you're doing this hike, and your baby is looking out at this canyon scene. This is probably what your baby sees. Okay. So there's a lot of differences: poor visual acuity, poor depth perception, and really poor color vision. So in particular, the yellow-blue opponent process is immature at birth, and it may be that newborns are really just seeing shades of red and green. Okay. So that's our best guess as to what a baby is seeing. On the other hand, if you're doing this hike and you've taken a psychedelic drug, you might see the canyon something like that. So these are like two opposite extremes on one continuum. So in this sense, of course, the psychedelic model doesn't really make sense. But yeah, there is some overlap. It just, the model has its limitations. All right. Finally, let's talk about the practicality of all of this. Is this just interesting philosophically or scientifically, or does this actually matter? Okay, well, you don't have to go back very far in history, only to the 1980s, to find a time when infants were operated on, in particular, newborn infants were operated on without anesthesia. Okay, so of course, this doesn't happen anymore. But there's a very, frankly, disturbing description of this in Jonathan Birch's new book, The Edge of Sentience. So you can find that in chapter 10. Now you might think, okay, today we know better than that, and we don't hurt infants anymore, but it's a little bit more complicated. So there are a lot of painful procedures that infants undergo in the neonatal ICU, not surgeries necessarily, but things like nasal suctionings. And there was a study that found in as recently as 2009, most infants don't receive any analgesia. Okay, they're not given any morphine for this. They're certainly not given anesthetics for this. And that proportion actually used to be higher that got morphine. So this was a follow-up study to one that was done several years beforehand, where it was actually found that most of them did receive analgesia. And if I recall correctly, it was simply that they didn't notice that the morphine was diminishing this behavioral pain response in the infants, so they kind of stopped doing it. So there still really is this problem of infant pain. And if we think that infants are conscious, and especially if newborns in the ICU are conscious, we need to take this seriously. On the other hand, when we talk about fetal consciousness, especially in the modern context of, like, say, American politics, people think, oh, maybe this is going to have really shattering societal implications. But I think that is a little bit exaggerated. So if you look at different abortion laws around the world, and by the way, there's a really nice interactive map of this on the Center for Reproductive Rights. Their website has a really nice interactive map. So you can check that out, click on different countries, and you can actually look at the gestational limits on abortion. You don't see that it's going on past 24 weeks, okay? Like, when we're talking about 24 weeks is the very earliest that consciousness might begin. This is past the gestational limits on abortion in virtually all jurisdictions, okay? So it's not really, like, going to be relevant in this case. I think a lot of people, their mind goes here first, and they think this is what's going to be very controversial, but in my view, it's really not. So finally, we should consider whether consciousness actually begins gradually or suddenly. So a lot of people, including myself, have the intuition that consciousness would begin gradually. It's not like there's this first moment where, boom, everything's there. But even if it begins gradually, I still don't think there's any contradiction in talking about what we've been talking about today, because, if you imagine having a light bulb and the sort of like analog dial, okay, and you slowly turn the dial, and there's this first moment where a first photon of light leaves that light bulb. Okay, so by analogy, even if the onset of consciousness is gradual, there's going to be some first moment where there's a first experience. So I don't think it's incoherent to talk about this. All right. So just to summarize this rather long presentation for all of you, there are markers of consciousness, right? There are markers of consciousness that have been validated in adults. We can apply them in infants, and we see that a lot of these markers are already present in the first months of life. So I think it's very plausible that consciousness is in place near birth, if not perhaps a bit earlier. And infant consciousness really matters. It has practical implications, particularly for neonates in the ICU. So I want to give some acknowledgements. Obviously, there's a lot of collaborators who I'm really indebted to, but just to name a few of the big ones right here. So there's Dr. Katrin Sippel at the Fetal MEG Center in Tübingen. She's developed a lot of in-house algorithms for pre-processing the data, which is a really difficult thing to do. You have to remove the maternal heart signal, the fetal heart signal. So she's developed those processing pipelines and has been essential for all the fetal MEG work. There's, of course, Dr. Julia Moser, who I've already mentioned, formerly at University of Tübingen, now at the University of Minnesota. And then my collaborators, Larina Naci and Professor Rodri Kuzak and Tim Bain. These were my co-authors on the review we had in Trends in Cognitive Sciences late last year, Consciousness in the Cradle. And then, of course, Professor Hubert Preissel, the director of the Fetal MEG Center at the University of Tübingen. So I didn't get to talk very much about models or theories in this presentation, but I do have a lot of opinions about them. So if you're curious, I'm just going to do a shameless plug. I have a new Substack newsletter called Something It's Like. Okay, and for instance, my last post on there, I give my take on the view that IIT implies some kind of free will, which I disagree with. I think that's a bad view. So you can read my opinions on that. You can also read, I have some book reviews. I have a review of Christoph Koch's new book, Then I Am Myself the World, and also a review of Eric Howell's book from last year, The World Behind the World. So please check that out if you're interested. All right, so thank you very much for your attention. I'll go to questions.